Back when I was a 10-year-old, if you asked me who my favorite author was, I had an answer all ready to go. It was Bohl. Of course, if you pressed me on that, I'd have to admit that I hadn't read that many of his writings, but there was this one particular series of books that made him my favorite author, and that was Zaanan, or as I would have pronounced it back then, Zaanan. And then after that, I would have passionately tried to sell you on how awesome they are, how you got to go read them as soon as possible. And one thing's for sure, those Zaanan books definitely were something of a kind of unique, anomalous, kind of in a category of its own kind of thing, at least in my household back in the late 90s, early 2000s. I turned 10 in 2001. So the Zaanan books, they were part of this series of these tiny little paperbacks called the Young Readers Christian Library, which were mostly these kind of par for the course, mass market children's stuff, Bible stories, missionary stories. There was this one minimalist children's version of Pilgrim's Progress. And then there was Zaanan, this outer space sci-fi action adventure story about this spacefaring Power Ranger-ish commando who works for an evil supercomputer that rules planet Earth in a dystopian future. So we had space battles and robots and conspiracies and missions that take you into volcanoes and creepy stasis pod graveyards and forbidden radioactive regions of space. Needless to say, Zaanan stood out as a little bit unique. And then the fact that it was Christian, as far as I was concerned, was kind of an added bonus. I remember at one point when I was 10 or 11-ish, I remember thinking of Zaanan as this really uniquely kind of stellar example of a Christian story that's so good that you kind of forget that it's Christian. Of course, now when I reread it as an adult, I find myself cringing and shuddering at all the Pulp Fiction cheese, the half-baked lines of dialogue, the implausible plot elements, etc. Not to mention, there's at least one scene that's just way too much in common with this particular scene straight out of Star Wars Episode 4. And as for the Christianity that's presented, well, let's just say it's a quirky mixture of some really nice nods to early church history combined with the really simplistic theological cheese that tends to characterize evangelical cliches from the 90s. And let's not forget while we're at it that it's only from an adult point of view you realize just how really straight up weird it is to have your main characters named after obscure Old Testament references like Zaanan and Asaph. But here's the deal. None of that stuff is the stuff that made me fall in love with Zaanan as an 8, 9, and 10-year-old. When I first got handed The Fatal Limit by my sister and started eagerly chipping my way through Chapter 1, it was spaceships and giant computers and robots and power arms that I was reading about. And it was readable because it was at my age level, unlike this one other fantasy book that I remember my sister had given me right before that, which was a little bit beyond my grade level. And then, it's one thing to identify enjoyment that I had as a kid, and then it's another thing to identify the influence or the impact that a book had on me as a developing kid and as a human being and as a developing Christian even at a young age. And as I read and reread those books over and over again during those formative years in the probably 8 to 11-year-old-ish window, there are a number of important things that I think these books were communicating to me that, of course, I didn't realize they were communicating. But those kinds of things are, I think, the true legacy of Zaanan, not the Pulp Fiction sci-fi bits and not the surfacey late 20th century cliche-centric theology. So here are 5 thoughts that come to my mind as I reflect on what I think the formative impact of the Zaanan books really was for me, and what I suspect the legacy of the Zaanan books has probably been for a lot of young people who grew up reading them. So my first one here is that God can be in outer space, and God and Christianity can still be there in the future. So anyone who's a fan of Star Trek, for example, knows that if you meet God in outer space, it's probably actually an evil alien. And then if you get into Star Wars, you're definitely not going to be praying to an infinite personal God within any of those places, because that would just be a little bit pointless. But I remember this one time as I reread the Zaanan story as a 9-year-old or something like that. And I had this kind of weird, startled kind of like aha moment when I realized that Zaanan, the character Zaanan, was sitting in his starfighter hurling through space because his ship was out of control. And he decided to pray. And I kind of thought in my head as a little kid, like, wait a minute, isn't that a little bit absurd? Here we are in outer space in a spaceship. There's no God to pray to in that world, is there? So the Zaanan stories kind of break the paradigm in that way, but they do it in a way that kind of makes it feel really normal and obvious. Of course, flying around in a spaceship doesn't render prayer absurd. How on earth would that do that? Zaanan praying in his craft as he lost power and floated helplessly toward the fatal limit. I'm pretty sure that was the scene in which it dawned on me that this was actually a Christian story, because I had kind of missed that part somehow in my first couple times reading it. And anyway, so that aha moment that I had as a little kid there, I think that's one of the biggest parts of Zaanan's legacy for me. So that was my first one, God can be in outer space. And then number 2 here, epic sci-fi doesn't need aliens. Heck, why would it? So this was the other odd moment for me as a kid, another aha moment that I think I probably had shortly after the other one I just mentioned. This was this kind of odd moment when my young self suddenly realized that there were no aliens anywhere in the Zaanan stories, and yet it was still this very expansive and detailed outer space world. We had the Sphere citizens, we had the Talgans with their power arms and their kind of Power Ranger-ish gadgetry. We had the deadly Sphere secret police. We had these space pirates running around. We had the Troves bad guys, kind of like Romulans without the pointy ears. You got ship computers that talk to you. We've got droid-like robots, and then one particular great big giant robot that's getting ready for mass destruction. Dang, with all that, who needs aliens? And whatever were aliens anyway? How are Romulans any different from the Troves in terms of story role, potential for making characters with it, stuff like that? Now, of course, I'm not saying that I think that Christian story writers or that Christian stories have to be alien-free like Zaanan. I think we as Christians should feel free to use our God-given imaginations and creativity in every expansive way in sci-fi just as much as we would in fantasy. So you can write stories about wizards with blue hats, you can write stories about green aliens with suction cups, just as much as you want. But I'm just saying I think there's something so tidy and so beautifully obvious about this one particular element that made Zaanan so effective in presenting a deeply and explicitly Christian and spiritually focused story to me as a kid in a convincing way that felt realistic. Of course, I say felt realistic to an 8-year-old. It felt very real for a lot of reasons, but all right, so number 1, God can be in outer space. Number 2, epic sci-fi doesn't need aliens. Why would it? Number 3, now this one's not something that I noticed as a kid, but it's something I've mused about within myself a great many times since I revisited those books within the last several years as an adult. It's just that kids often don't notice cheesy ripoffs. And I'm not just talking about the Pulp Fiction flavor and how so many elements were just kind of run-of-the-mill sci-fi tropes. I'm talking about stuff like that Meroth scene that feels like it's just a transplant from Star Wars. At the time, I had never seen Star Wars, but I'm talking about stuff like the power arm that was literally a visual carbon copy of the failed Nintendo accessory called the Power Glove that was released the same year that Zaanan Book 1 came out, The Fatal Limit, 1989. A lot of the time, kids don't notice these things. If you had asked me if there was anything questionable in the Zaanan books back then, the only thing I would have said is that it can't really be a Christian book because it shows Zaanan kissing Flera. Or it can't really be a Christian book because it makes the Antichrist out to be a computer. I mean, no, that's not right. But as for the pop culture imitation cheese and the theological cheese and the cheesy dialogue and characterization, that stuff was invisible. Not just invisible because I couldn't identify them, but also invisible, I think, in terms of them actually having any kind of positive or negative impact on me. The things that I did notice were that Christians can exist in outer space, that the ichthus fish, they didn't call it the ichthus, but that the fish was used as a first-century Christian code, that Christians value family and loving community. And sometimes that can become distinctively Christian when other cultures move away from that. And stuff like that it's a psychological norm that somebody separated from his parents may end up longing for that relationship as one of the deepest longings over the course of their life. And that honor received based on lies is empty. If you remember, that's the beginning of Zaanan's disillusionment with Sphere, when Sphere makes him out to be a legend, but it's all a lie. And I could keep on adding more, but you get the point. These are just the ones off the top of my head. All right, so number 1, God can be in outer space. Number 2, epic sci-fi doesn't need aliens. Number 3, kids often don't notice cheesy ripoffs. Number 4, outer space stories are not mutually exclusive from the rest of life, i.e. from faith. In a way, I think Zaanan sort of served to redeem the genre of sci-fi for me in a funny kind of way. Not that I would have loved Star Trek any less if I didn't have Zaanan, but it's kind of like Zaanan proved that the things that I loved the most about other spaceship stories didn't actually have anything to do with the parts that require or assume the exclusion of God, prayer, the Bible, salvation, etc. And this also does something for everyone's own creative freedom. So while, for starters, like I said above, I see no need to be shy about chatting about or telling stories about aliens, wizards, dragons, mages, or psionically attuned Protoss High Templar, but that said, when is the last time you felt you had permission to tell a story in an outer space, human-populated world in which Christians believe and practice the gospel? Pray from inside a cockpit, maybe turn around and do their devotions inside that cockpit. A place where Tro's enforcers walk around holding a laser gun while looking around for a Christian ichthus fish on a wall. Here's the thing. Maybe the problem of lack of creativity in Christianity, maybe the problem isn't generally the problem that we are all too rigid to add the bizarre just for the fun of it. We're too rigid to add aliens and laser guns into our Christian stories. Maybe actually the real problem of lack of creativity in Christianity is more often that we are too rigid to do something that isn't normal for the genre that we are mindlessly imitating. So we're too rigid to try something new that is even more authentically Christian. And whatever you want to say about how pulpy the Zaanan books are, I think these books are the result of Al Bohl using his God-given creativity to feel the liberty to change the rules of stereotypical sci-fi. And I say, way to go, bro. That's what true creativity is. And then number 5, just like outer space stories are not mutually exclusive from the rest of life, such as faith, the Christian faith is not mutually exclusive from that which is futuristic or spacefaring sci-fi. So I guess I'm kind of restating what I said from my point 1 above, that God can be in outer space and God and Christianity can still be there in the future. But I think it's good for us to recognize and feel the fact that the truths about God belong on a greater scale than all the impressive stuff we see in sci-fi. But also to add to that, if you're a kid and you find yourself fantasizing with a certain amount of credulity about a Star Trek-ish kind of future, a book like Zaanan kind of gives you permission to not worry about that. But then in so doing, it also opens your eyes to the fact that there's nothing about a futuristic, techie future that makes the supernatural any less credible or any less relevant than it is in our current day with all the tech that we currently have. Now, the exception, of course, would be when the fantasy parts of sci-fi end up being overplayed. In Star Trek, for example, their use of supernatural aliens and bizarre space-time phenomena sometimes, it kind of turns it into a little bit like the Twilight Zone. And obviously, trying to picture somebody going to church and trusting in the Christian God within that kind of universe gets kind of awkward pretty fast. But that's not because of the sci-fi in the sense of the techie outer space aspects. It's because of these specific other things, these other artistic decisions and the genre limitations imposed by the creators. So those are my 5 points there. God can be in outer space. Epic sci-fi doesn't need aliens. Kids often don't notice cheesy ripoffs. Outer space stories are not mutually exclusive from the rest of life, such as faith, and the Christian faith is not mutually exclusive from the futuristic or the spacefaring sci-fi stuff. So those are my 5 points, and in a way you could almost say, it's almost like Zaanan continues to have a positive impact on me, indirectly because of the legacy that it imprinted onto me back when I was an impressionable 10-year-old. And I think I'll always have positive memories about Zaanan, but more importantly, I'll always have these constructive ideas that Zaanan gave me through the quirky black and white artwork that Al Bohl sketched back in the early 90s. And I think this might suggest a couple of things for us. For one thing, I think it's important for us as Christians who have any amount of interest in creativity, the arts, fiction, books, movies, stuff like that. I think it's important that we are able to judiciously temper our critical and artistic intuitions by combining our love for excellence with a kind of judicious, open-minded pragmatism. Because Zaanan, which made a pretty massive impact on me as a kid, is really not a great work of fiction by any standard, and it never will be, but it didn't have to be. When I go back to Zaanan as an adult, I shudder, not just at the cheese and the implausible bits of plot and world building, but also at the theological quirkiness, like the fortune cookie approach to scripture, the cringeworthy faith healing scenes, the really incredulous evangelistic encounters, etc. But none of those things were the formative elements that stuck with me and made an impact. Quite the contrary, there are certain very important key elements that spoke so much more loudly than all of those deficiencies, and those are the things that have actually made a lasting impact on children like me. You could say a book like Zaanan is simply this. There was a guy within the church, capital C, within the church, there was a guy who made a couple of little stories for kids to read in order to have fun and also to help shape them in ways that he felt were important. And when you put it like that, it suddenly starts to sound a lot more relational and situational and interpersonal and a whole lot less, shall we say, literary. Suddenly it has less and less to do with standards of excellence or whether it was any good. It's just somebody telling stories to somebody else's kids. And my point is, maybe the literary excellence perspective is not the only concern that a writer or that a parent or a teacher might be justified in considering. And once we recast it like that into this much more forgiving, more relational and situational paradigm, then we might start to realize, isn't that kind of just how the body of Christ works? Every one of us has a role to play, and we're only expected to be able to do what God has made us to be able to do. Al Bohl made an impact on my spiritual and cognitive development, and he didn't have to be a Steven Spielberg or an H.G. Wells or a C.S. Lewis in order to do that. He just had something that God gave him that other people didn't seem to have, so he shared it, and he had a good time while he was at it, and we had a good time too. So as Christians, why don't we all make that a point for how we live our lives? Why don't we, each of us, just try to do that thing, to take whatever gifts we've been given without obsessing about imperfection or perfection, and just aim to edify one another's faith while doing our limited best to pay attention to things like artistic excellence and appeal and enjoyment and motivation and enthusiasm and all such endless things worth focusing on and worth honoring God by excelling at to the extent that we can. My guess is that the time for Zaanan to shine has pretty much passed, but the body of Christ is alive. And because the most central message of Zaanan was always the simple and profound message that God is alive and the scriptures are rich and Jesus calls us to follow him, because that was the message of Zaanan and because it communicated that successfully to the intended audience, in that sense, the message of Zaanan lasts kind of forever. And somehow that starts to sound a whole lot more impressive than literary excellence or quality.